Hello, and welcome back here to English 111 at Delta College. This is week 4, and this week we are going to have another lesson in revision and editing. As I said previously, for each of these assignments, there's going to be a revision and editing lesson that's associated with it that builds on what came before. So last time we talked about revision in general, and we looked at editing punctuation, which is the smallest unit of meaning in writing. This week, we're going to focus on revising introductions and editing words, the next unit of meaning in writing. So let's go ahead and get started. So, revising introductions. There are 3 things that an introduction needs to do. Now, introductions should do more than that, but there are 3 things that they need to do, at least within the context of academic writing. And that is, they need to provide context, they need to introduce the topic, and they need to state the thesis. Now, context, or the thematic subject, is the background information that the reader needs to know in order to be able to understand whatever it is that you're writing about. So it is the subject area that you're addressing. It's the broad general subject. The topic is the specific aspect of that subject that you're going to focus on. It could be a question, or it could be a debate or a controversy. And then your thesis is your stance, your opinion about that topic, about that controversy or debate, or it's your answer to that question. So this is often represented, introductions are often represented as inverted triangles, where you go from the broad base of the subject at the top and you move down to the narrow points of the focus of the thesis. So you're consistently narrowing the focus of your topic, your issue, whatever it is that you're going to be focusing on or writing about. So subject, which is the background context, topic, which is the specific thing that you're going to focus on, and thesis is your stance or your opinion about that topic. So that's what an introduction needs to do. It needs to give all 3 of those parts. Introduction should do more, and introduction should connect with the audience and make the audience want to read your paper or your essay or whatever it is that you've written. It needs to create what we call the personal interest factor, or the PIF. And there are several techniques that you can use to be able to do that, such as questions. Asking questions work in order to hook the reader for a couple reasons. First of all, there's an extra dimension of visual interest because you're using question marks which break up the blockiness of the text. So it helps to draw the eye. Also, as readers, or really just as people, when we read or hear a question, we feel compelled to answer it. Even if it's a rhetorical question, in which case the answer is implied by the question itself, we still feel a tension that we need to relieve by answering a question. So when you ask a question in your introduction, the reader feels a need to get the answer to that question. Similarly, quotations work as well because, again, it provides that visual interest by using the quotation marks to break up the blockiness of the text, so it draws the eye. But also, quotations represent dialogue or conversation. And so as readers, when we see quotations, we feel as if we're being asked to participate in a conversation or a discussion. So it creates that hook. Anecdotes are stories which are used to illustrate a point. They're forms of examples or evidence. The idea is if you have maybe a difficult concept or an abstraction that's difficult to relate to, you can sort of humanize it or make it easier to relate to by telling a little story to illustrate your point. So again, as readers, we like establishing that common ground by giving us something to relate to. So anecdotes can be done to do that. Startling facts or assertions, and you can do this in your thesis because, again, a thesis is a statement of opinion. It is what we call an assertion. It is a forceful statement or bold statement that something is so. And it can be a statement of opinion, so it doesn't have to be factually true, as we've talked about before when we make the different types of claims that we make when we write. One example is a claim of truth, which is where we present something as being true, whether it's factually true or not. We're just presenting it as if it is a truth. Well, that's an assertion. So an assertion is a bold statement that something is so, and you can use that to sort of startle or provoke an emotional response from a reader or an audience. And you can use startling facts to be able to do that as well, to sort of cultivate surprise in on the part of the reader. And you can use allusions to make a connection with the reader. An allusion is a reference to something that you expect your audience to know and understand. So it is a form of shorthand. By making the reference to something that they know, you're able to allow them to bring their knowledge of the reference and apply it to whatever it is that you're talking about. So, for example, if I were to say that your grade in this class is like the Titanic, well, if you know what happened to the Titanic, then that makes sense to you. You're able to supply your knowledge to the current situation. So allusions work by appealing to what people already know. To see some of these techniques being used, let's take a look at the article To Stir with Love by Emily Nussbaum. It's one of the required or assigned readings for the evaluation essay. And let's take a look at the introduction here. And notice that the introduction consists of the first 3 paragraphs. There is this fallacy or this false belief that an introduction needs to be crammed into 1 paragraph. There's that old advice that writing teachers used to give that, a good essay consists of 5 paragraphs. You have your introduction, you have your 3 body paragraphs, and then you have your conclusion. And to some extent, that does work. I mean, that presents a nice sort of roundness to a reader. It feels complete. But when you get into more advanced writing and advanced courses where you have to write, let's say, a 20-page research paper, 5 paragraphs doesn't work. So don't think in terms of paragraphs. Think in terms of sections. So having an introductory section, having 3 supporting sections for the body, and then having a concluding section. So you don't have to limit yourself to just 1 paragraph. And it's really more interesting to use multiple paragraphs. So in this case, the first 3 paragraphs are the introduction. And that makes sense because an introduction needs to do 3 things. It has to present the subject, the topic, and the thesis. And so you can do that in 3 paragraphs easily. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. In 1968, Nora Ephron wrote a tart expose of New York's backbiting food establishment. At the end, she asked its members of haute cuisine, if haute cuisine would survive. Of course it will last, Poppy Cannon argued, just in the way sculpture will last. Nika Hazelton disagreed, saying that the old cuisine is gone for good and dying out. She predicted ultimately cooking will be like an indoor sport, just like making lace and handiwork. The late 60s are not generally considered an age of innocence, but there you go. Neither Cannon nor Hazelton nor Ephron herself envisioned anything like today's gladiatorial, whirligig culinary culture, which has expanded far beyond the salons of the Upper East Side. Instead of a few competing cookbooks and restaurants, we have Lucky Peach and Chowhound and Iron Chef, not to mention Sandra Lee on YouTube making a baked potato out of ice cream, rolling it in cocoa powder, and garnishing it with chives, pistachios dyed deep green. Culinary taste now indicates not merely economic class, but morality and excuse me, but morality and environmental chic as well. Across the globe, celebrity chefs clash like clans in Game of Thrones. Yet even as whole channels of food programming have emerged, I've been a conscientious objector, or maybe a deserter. Unlike Efron, I'm a subsistence cook at best. My specialty is a Turkish spinach lentil soup from the cookbook Sundays at Moosewood Restaurant, which I haven't actually prepared in 3 years. Among the many options, two TV genres dominate: the traditional stand and stir, popularized by Julia Child, and the reality competition, spearheaded by Iron Chef. They suggest opposing food philosophies. Julia Child took an occult discipline, once reserved for men in tall hats, and made it accessible to all. Her show implied that food might, in fact, be easier than you ever imagined, and that cooking itself was no big deal. The reality show begs to differ. In these chef versus chef contests, food is a perpetual emergency. Every single contestant might, under more ordinary circumstances, be an excellent cook, capable of hosting relaxed weekly dinner parties. But when they are faced with a rasher of kelp plus extra virgin honey and a ticking timer, even the production of appetizers becomes something out of 24. Okay, so let's look at this and analyze it and break it down and identify which of the techniques that Nussbaum is using in order to engage the reader. She uses quotations. A corset will last, Poppy Cannon argued, just in the way sculpture will last. Nika Hazelton disagreed, sighing that the old cuisine is gone for good and dying out. She predicted ultimately cooking would be like an indoor sport, just like making lace and handiwork. So right there in that first paragraph, we have a series of quotations being used, which help to draw the eye and engage the reader in a conversation. She begins that first paragraph with an anecdote. In 1968, Nora Ephron wrote a tart expose of New York's backbiting food establishment. So she tells this little story of the writer Nora Ephron going into New York in the 1960s and examining food culture there and what it was like. She uses that to set up her point, that, or rather her subject that she's going to be analyzing, which is the way that food culture on television has changed. So it helps to illustrate her point. She uses several allusions, notably to YouTube, Game of Thrones, and 24, which are things that she's relying on her audience to know so they can supply their understanding to what she's talking about. If you know Game of Thrones or 24 and how they're sort of very dramatic dramas on TV that involve a lot of what are the terms I'm looking for? Conflict and sort of fast-paced storytelling. You can take your understanding of that and apply it to what she's talking about in terms of modern food shows. And then she makes assertions. Neither Cannon nor Hazelton nor Ephron herself envision anything like today's gladiatorial, whirligig culinary culture. And in fact, the entire third paragraph is a series of assertions. So statements of opinion that are presented in a bold way. So she's using several of these techniques in order to engage the reader. So you can use this as a model when you write your own essays. Okay, so that's enough for a revision for this week. Let's shift over to editing and focus on word errors. So word errors fall into three general categories: those which are homonyms, those which are grammatical errors, and those which are just simple spelling errors. The most common errors are homonyms. Homonyms are words that either are spelt in the same way, in which case they're called homographs. Homographs are words that are spelt in the same way, but they're pronounced differently. And more commonly, you have homophones, which are words that are pronounced in the same way or sound alike, but have different meanings. So the most common type of word error are homonymic. Grammatical errors are where people just use the wrong word because they don't understand what the word means, perhaps, or they use the wrong form of it. And then the third most common, or in terms of frequency, spelling errors come in. These are just people. There are certain words that are just hard to spell, and you have to kind of train yourself to watch out for them. So, as I said, there are two types of homonyms: homophones, which are words that have the same sound, and homographs, which are words that have the same writing. There are probably more homophones than there are homographs, or at least people have more trouble with homophones than they do with homographs. The only homograph that people get into trouble with is the words, excuse me, lead and lead. So Lead. Two words which are spelt alike but have different meanings. So lead is the verb to lead, and then lead is the noun identifying the material, the mineral of lead, or the element rather. Um, People get confused about the past tense of to lead, which is also lead, but in that case it's spelled Led, not Lead. So people get into trouble with the homophone of lead. So that's the only one that people have trouble with when it comes to homographs. By far, the most frequent homonymic errors are those which are based on sound. So here's a list of probably the most common homophonic errors, or at least the most common ones that I've seen. Their, to, its, whose, and so on. And of course, people know the difference between these. I think what happens is they get a little bit lazy when it comes to writing, or when it comes to proofreading, rather, especially on social media, which is where you see a lot of these errors. Um, and you know how to spell these, but like I said, you get lazy when it comes to proofreading, so you don't check to make sure that you spell them correctly. So there, for example, you have three forms of there. The first one, THERE, means place or location. The second one, THEIR, is a possessive, something that belongs to them. And then the third one is the contraction of they are. And people don't have too much trouble with that, I think, because they realize or they remember that the apostrophe means that it's a contraction. It's the other two forms of there that they confuse or they misuse. So that's something you have to watch out for. Also, to is a preposition. It means to do something or to go somewhere. TWO is the number two, and people realize that, I think, because the W stands out to them. It's the other form of TOO, which acts as an intensifier, such as too much or too little, or it also means also. So it's TO and TOO that people have trouble with, usually using TO in place of TOO. So that's almost a spelling error, more than an actual homophonic error, but it is technically a homophone. I have trouble with this one myself because it it doesn't sort of follow the rule of possessives. In order to create a possessive, ordinarily you would use an apostrophe. But in this case, it's without the apostrophe is the possessive. With the apostrophe, it's the contraction of it is. And so that throws a lot of people off. And again, I always have to stop and think about that one myself. It's the same thing with whose. Without the apostrophe, it's a possessive. With the apostrophe, it's a contraction of who is. Sight, right, night would be another one. Okay. This is the sort of thing which drives non-native speakers nuts. Why is it that English has so many words that are spelled differently but are pronounced in the same way? There's a couple reasons for this. For one thing, many of these words aren't supposed to be pronounced in the same way, but we get kind of lazy when it comes to pronunciation, especially here in America. But also, the English language has evolved. So words that were originally pronounced differently have changed so that they're pronounced in the same way now. So in the case of sight, technically, those were all originally pronounced differently. So CITE was originally pronounced as Kita, SITE was originally pronounced as Sita, and SIGHT was originally pronounced as sit. English begins as a form of German called Anglo-Saxon, so it has very sort of Germanic roots in the original pronunciation, which we've thrown out since then. Same thing with right, night, lights. Well, sort of. Night, Night, and K, Night. What's up with the K? Why is night, Knight, pronounced that way? Why don't we pronounce the K? Well, originally the K was pronounced. It was Knicht back in the Old English or Anglo-Saxon days. I'm not sure why it is that we don't pronounce the K anymore. But also, people do get confused, and our society has helped to confuse people about certain words. So if you ever see night spelled Nite, uh, that's not a real word, or light, Lite. That's not a real word, but you'll often see them used as if they are real words on products in our society. And so you kind of get tricked into thinking that that's the way something is meant to be spelled or pronounced. Right, or ite, is a real word, just to confuse things more. That's a word which means a ritual or something that is sacred or holy, a rite of passage or last rites, for example. Now, I've put a couple asterisks here on this list. So, right, WRIGHT, that's technically another form of right, but you don't see that too often anymore. Usually it's used as a person's family name rather than a proper noun. But a right means someone who makes something like a shipwright or a playwright. So you still see it sometimes, although it's kind of archaic now. And then through and through, there's another example of our society trying to make you dumb. If you ever see a sign for a drive-through and it's spelled THRU, that's not a real word. So watch out for that. Don't use that. Break and break. That's an easier. I think that's probably more of a spelling error, although technically it is homophonic. And then your. There are technically three forms of your, although that third one, YORE, again, it's really archaic, it's old fashioned. You don't see it too often anymore, but you do still come across it sometimes. It's the other two forms of your that people misuse all the time. So, and again, it breaks that pattern of using apostrophes to form possessives. So in this case, your without the apostrophe is a possessive. With the apostrophe, it's a contraction of you are. So you have to watch out for these. Now, this is just a fun fact that I like to share because I studied, Old English and Middle English, and I don't really get a chance to talk about it too often. But your was originally pronounced as Thor, or Thor to be more accurate. Um, again, going back to the idea of why is it that English has so many words that are pronounced in the same way, but they're spelled differently. One of the reasons for the change is our alphabet has changed over time because of the introduction of the printing press. So in Old English, the th sound was represented by a character that we call a thorn, which is not used in other languages, specifically French. And the printing press was introduced into England from France. And so, using French type, how do you represent that sound of the thorn, the th? Well, now we use the T and H to represent it, although technically it should be tah instead of th. Another way is to try to visually represent it using the letter or the character Y, because the character of the thorn looks, kind of like of Y. And so words that were spelt with Y's were originally pronounced as the. So your was originally Thor. And so long ago in the days of yore was actually long ago in the days of Thor, the god of thunder, again, going back to that Anglo-Saxon history of England. So just a fun fact for you that I don't get to share too often. False homophone errors. So like I said, there are several words that we mispronounced. We pronounce them in the same way, even though technically they're not supposed to be. And so we end up with these false homophones. So accept and except, for example, which ironically mean opposite things. Accept means to take in, except means to leave out. Affect and effect. Affect is usually used as a verb. Effect is usually used as a noun. Whether and whether, I see this one misused all the time, and it's really kind of annoying. Weather, without the H, refers to what's going on outside in terms of the atmosphere. Whether, with the H, is representing some kind of opposition, as in whether or not. Past and past. This is confusing. Past, P-A-S-S-E-D, basically it's a verb, whereas past with the T is a noun. So as a verb, it would be, I went past the house on the left. Past as a noun is typically used to refer to time as the past tense or something that happened in the past. Then and than, people know the difference there. It's just, I think that's probably more of a lazy spelling error when they confuse those. Root and route, that confuses me. Those are pronounced completely differently. I don't know why people pronounce them in the same way. And again, through and light, those second forms there that I've put the asterisk next to, those aren't real words, so don't use them unless you want to incur my wrath. So, like I said, the most common word errors are homophonic. The second most common word errors are grammatical. So this is where people just get confused about the meaning of a word and use the wrong word or the wrong form of a word. And often it comes down to parts of speech. So quote and quotation, for example. Quote is a verb, quotation is a noun. You're not to use them interchangeably. And I know, again, this is an example of our society conspiring to make people dumb. But when you see a commercial for an insurance company and they say, call now for a free rate quote, they're lying to you. Quote is not a noun, it's a verb. So don't confuse those again unless you want to incur my wrath. Less and fewer, another common example. If you go to a grocery store and you get a handful of items and you want to use the express checkout, often there's the sign that says 12 items or less. And that's wrong. It should be 12 items or fewer. You use less for amounts that cannot be divided or counted. You use fewer for amounts that can be divided and counted. Anxious and eager, again, kind of opposite meanings. Anxious implies fear or anxiety, and eagerness implies what's the word? Excitement. So I've heard so many people say things like, "I'm really anxious to see this movie." Oh, if it provokes anxiety, then don't see it, right? But that's not what they mean. Literally and figuratively, yeah, literally means an actual fact. Figuratively means not an actual fact, as a figure of speech. Good and well, very commonly confused. And of course, these words can be used in multiple ways. Good could be a noun, as in goods and services. Well could be a noun, as in something that you get water from. But when people confuse them, it's as adjectives and adverbs. So if I were to ask, how are you doing? You would be doing well, because well is an adverb. The question asks, how are you doing? Doing being a verb. Adverbs are words which modify or describe verbs. So you're doing well. Good, in this case, would be an adjective, and adjectives are used to modify or describe nouns. So you could say that was a good movie. You wouldn't say that's a well movie. That wouldn't make sense. So how are you doing? You're doing well. You're not doing good, unless you're Superman. Who and whom. So you may recall that the three parts of a sentence are the subject, verb, and object. Who refers to the subject of the sentence. Whom refers to the object. So who is the actor? Whom is the receiver? Credible and creditable. Credible means trustworthy. Creditable means able to receive credit. And then this next one really, really annoys me. And I've seen it, an increase in it over the past several years for some reason. Decent. You turn on the news and you get the weather report, and there's a decent chance of rain. There's not a decent chance of rain, because the opposite of decent is indecent. So you wouldn't say there's an indecent chance of rain. You could say there's a good chance of rain or a high chance of rain. You wouldn't say there's a decent chance of rain or he did a decent job. Decent implies morality of being decent or indecent. It does not mean the same as good or bad. So don't misuse it. Okay, and then spelling errors. The third most common type of error. And usually, I think what happens here again, it's a matter of laziness. People have gotten so used to spell check programs or autocorrect that they don't bother to check their spelling. And the problem with that is that a spell check program only checks for spelling. It doesn't check for meaning. So you can have a word that's spelled correctly, but it's not the right word. So definite versus defiant. I've seen that one so many times. Definites, something is definitely true. I've seen it as it's defiantly true. And is it really defiantly true? I suppose it could be, but I don't think that's what you mean. It's probably definitely true. So there is no A in definite. Another one which I've seen so often, and this one usually makes me laugh, is possess, misspelt as either poses or posses. And this is really a common thing. I think most spelling errors, people get confused if there's uh, double letters. So double S's, for example. Possess has two double S's in it. And people get confused. How many S's should there be in that word? So it often comes out as either poses or posses. So lose and loose would be another very common example. Again, the double O's, the double letters. The use of double letters in spelling confuses the crap out of people. Chose and choose. Um, you have to watch out for words that have double letters. And really, when it comes to spelling errors, yeah, use a spell check, but you still need to proofread to make sure it's spelled correctly, that you've got the right word. And when it comes to spelling errors, there's really no easy way to do it. You just have to know what words give you trouble and watch out for those. So if you're using a word that has double letters, take a little extra time and make sure that you've spelled that correctly. Quiet and quite, another common error, and this one makes sense. It's just a simple transposition of the last two letters. So quiet, quite, uh, where, were, and we're. Um, we're with the apostrophe, that's not misused too often. It's usually where and were that people get confused. Of and off, another example of the double letters. And then through and thorough, that throws people off because there is an extra O in thorough, which is just really confusing. And why is it pronounced through in the first place? Uh, THROUGH. How does that spell or equal through? It makes no sense. Yeah, it doesn't. You just have to get used to it. Um, know what your weaknesses are as a speller and watch out for those words when you use them. Um, a word that I used to be really problematic for me was separate. I always want to put an extra E in there. And so that's a word that I know that I have trouble with. So I watch out for that when I have to use it. So I be careful when it comes to spelling that. So yeah, just know what your weaknesses are when it comes to spelling and pay extra attention to those. And if you're using words that have double letters, pay extra attention to those. Watch out for those. Okay, so that's it for this week's lesson. The final draft of the second essay, the evaluation essay, is due at the end of this week. And now you are responsible for what we have covered in terms of revision and editing up to this point. So you should have an interesting introduction to your essay, one that engages the reader and presents the subject, topic, and thesis. That's going to be factored into the grade now. And in terms of editing, we've covered punctuation, and now we've covered word errors, common word errors. So you are responsible for using punctuation and words correctly and effectively. Okay, I'll talk to you again next week when we start the next assignment. So see you then. Take care, have fun, be excellent to each other.